It is my pleasure to welcome you all here today to our virtual event on building resilience, investing in mitigation. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors for this event, FEMA and Resilience Action Partners. For those of you watching this live on floodeconomics.com, you can ask questions to our panel members throughout the event, and we encourage you to do so. You can also tweet using the hashtag #EconResilience. With all of the recent flood and storm events, both in the United States and across the world, people are thinking about mitigation actions for the future. We'll be talking to our panelists today about how communities can invest now for the future. I have with me here today a number of panelists, starting here with Bessie Schwartz, who is the co-founder and chief executive of Cloud to Street, which sits at the nexus of big data, environmental science, and community empowerment. BJ Murphy is the mayor of Kinston, North Carolina, and has led his community through two major hurricanes, Irene and recently Matthew. Edgar Westerhoff is the flood risk and resiliency lead for North America at Arcadis. He is a city resilience and sustainability expert. And finally, we have Joe Cordes, the Associate Director of the Trattenberg School at George Washington University and an expert on the economics of mitigation. We also had Andrew Martin, FEMA's Risk Analysis Branch Chief for Region 2 here in the US, who planned to participate in today's panel discussion, but unfortunately was pulled away due to Hurricane Maria. He sends his regrets for not being able to participate, but of course the needs of the disaster survivors come first. So welcome to you all. I'm going to kick it off with a big picture question on mitigation in the US. The number of billion-dollar storms is increasing. Are we prepared here in the US for what's to come in the future?
That's a big one. Well, maybe I can share some thoughts on that. I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, I would say the US in general is very good at emergency response. You know, we really know how to communicate these kind of disasters. We've seen that during Harvey. We've seen it during Irma. There's a very strong, clear line of command when a disaster is about to strike. And that's critical, of course. So when it comes to avoid loss of life, that's key, emergency response. But when it comes to, I would say, post-disaster planning, flood mitigation, and that's what we are talking about here today, I think there are a couple of lessons that can be learned from across the globe, and that can be translated to cities in the US that are very vulnerable, exposed to waters, rising sea levels, land subsidence. You can bring it all together, and that's where the urbanization trend that is going on. In cities like New York, Boston, Miami, but also throughout the country. It's a tendency that we need to address, and combined with coastal vulnerability, that's an important one, and that's where I said we have some lessons to learn, I think.
Yes and no. So BJ, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. In the terms of are we prepared, I would say yes. I mean, I've sat in with at least two different governors now as they prepared and our state prepared for hurricanes and disasters and the post-op, really, and what do you do after the fact. And just watching what happened in Texas and in Florida, the mayors and the governors and the administration, they all seem to be on the same page. But it is very easy to dish out money after the fact or to make sure that people feel like, hey, we're coming to save today. It's a lot harder to have this conversation on what do we do to prepare for the next one. It's going to rain again. It's going to flood again. We're going to have another hurricane. The question is, to what extent will our damage be? I would say we're prepared. Yes, we do a lot of good things right. We got a lot of people who are resilient, but are we prepared as a nation and even as a state and a community to mitigate the next major one? I think the answer is not enough.
If I could follow up on that, and that is that Harvey and Irma actually have called attention to some things that do need to be addressed. So this focuses more on the no side of the answer. And what have we learned? Well, for example, Certainly in Harvey, there was some surprises in terms of areas that were flooded that historically have not experienced floods, and some people have attributed that to the fact that water levels have risen, for example. So we may not be as prepared as we need to be for adjusting to the consequences of severe storms as a result of rising sea levels, for example. Similarly, both storms have once again focused attention on the concentration of populations along coastlines. There are all sorts of good economic reasons why people would want to live along coastlines, but there's also some indication that in some cases public policies make it perhaps a little bit too easy for people to choose to locate in areas that are at a high risk of flooding. That's not a new issue. It's been debated ever since flood insurance was enacted way back in the 60s, I believe. But I think it's heightened attention on that, and I think that's another area where we need to take a look at this, because one way that you could reduce damage is you just don't put certain things in harm's way if you know that there's at least some likelihood that that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big and complicated question, so I think, of course, it's going to be both a yes and a no. Most of my work on flooding is in developing countries, in places where something of the magnitude of Harvey or Irma hits and thousands of people can die and do die. And so I think a lot about, I think the critical question is, do we have what it takes to make the critical decision at the right moment? Whether that is responding and getting people out beforehand or afterwards, or making long-term big investments in building walls around downtown Manhattan or around Houston, like the city actually asked for. And there's breakdowns at all different levels even here in the U.S. I see it mostly in developing countries, but there's a lot of unevenness. The great work that's happening in Kinston is not necessarily replicated in lots of places in the Rust Belt where we worked quite a bit, where they get hard hit. We look at things like, were we prepared when Sandy hit here in this town? And, we know that thousands of homes should have been on the FEMA flood map. The maps were outdated. People were unprepared, uninsured. But then that's an information breakdown. We also know risk is changing faster than ever. And the way that we analyze risk, the way we analyze the floodplains now, what we even conceptualize as a 100-year floodplain is changing dramatically. So we need to rethink that. And then data, just having the information, is by no means where it ends. You have to be able to understand it. The right people have to be able to have the power to use it. You get tied up in bureaucracy a lot of times. You can't FEMA, and what they're allowed to actually release about what they know is limited. And then do you have the funding and the control? So how Houston, I've heard, actually asked for a lot of mitigation efforts. Months, just even as far as months ago, they knew that this was coming. They said they were prepared for something like not even a 15-year flood. And, in Houston, I've heard thousands of people, they've been building homes in the 100-year floodplain. So what's going on? Is that a bureaucracy issue? The one other thing I just wanted to mention is that when we think about are we prepared, we think quite a bit about just general exposure, which is sort of in the sciences. Where's the hazard going to go, the physical hazard, and then how's the mitigation? What's the infrastructure look like? But disasters are social situations. They're social phenomena. And we are very unevenly prepared just based on existing inequity that lives across the country. I've been thinking quite a bit about stories we're hearing about nursing homes and elderly populations. A story from Florida about how 8 people died in a nursing home in Irma right across the street from an air-conditioned hospital. And this happens time elderly people die disproportionately in Katrina. We see this in our modeling. And just one thing I'll say, we have a research that we've done at Cloud to Street looked at a 500-year flood. If that hit the entire United States all at once, so if Harvey hit everywhere all at once, where are we going to see disproportionate deaths then just because of social conditions? And where are we going to see disproportionate property damage? And it's, we hope it'll get published in but we've seen that the disproportionate property damage will happen in communities mostly in the South, where there are a high percentage of renters, African Americans, right, and women living in or working in the civilian workforce.
This would be a great exercise, I would say, for many cities in the U.S. Is to perform a stress test. We spoke a bit before this interview. There's a lot of familiarity with lines of command and how to address an emergency when it's coming. But there are also stress tests. How does your city function during an extreme event? And talking about Harvey and those kind of extreme rains dropping down on your city. How does your city function? What is driving your city? I mean, I biked through the city of New York just before Sandy hit, and I saw how New York tried to prepare. I also biked through New York, through Manhattan the day after, to see how Manhattan came to a complete close. I mean, people couldn't get to work. The subway was shut down. So power generation, really the urbanistic key assets that we have, those need to be assessed. And if you can do that in a stress test, overlay risk with vulnerability, you can see how well your municipality is prepared.
And unfortunately, in our community, our stress test has actually been the actual event itself. And in '99, it was Floyd, and there were well over 800 properties in our city limits that FEMA and the city and the county bought out, which was a good thing because that mitigated when Matthew hit last year, those people were out of harm's way. However, upstream of us is a humongous urbanization shift. And so we're catching all the rainfall and the water runoff from upstream of us. So it's doing the water's doing things different. So we had another 200 homes in the city and county this time that are having discussions with FEMA. And are we prepared? I will say that over the years we've talked about it. In fact, 1965, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually did a study on our basin and said, hey, you need 13 reservoirs there. Only 2 were built. And if you look at 2017 dollars, if they had built all 13 and operated them during that time, it was $1.3 billion these last 52 years. Well, Matthew alone was $4.8 billion to our economy. So the question is, could we put some of that into some better mitigation efforts?
That's a great
Well,
example.
at least one bit of good news, possibly, is that the ability to do what Ed Kerr's described as stress tests or the type of analysis that Betsy's described is clearly much easier to do now than it was even 10 years ago. So this is definitely an area where big data, the ability to develop simulation models, can really help. And in the early 2000s still, this would have been quite tedious to do, to be honest with you, and expensive in terms of time and money, but now these things are getting easier to do and are probably well worth doing in a number of cases.
It requires also, I would say, integrated planning. So it's no longer, this is your problem at a city scale, and you try to address and work to a solution. It's really the integrated planning effort that's needed, where you assess the watershed and see how water funnels down and comes down to a city. It requires collaboration with bordering cities. So it's really connecting the various scales. If you bridge that to the Netherlands. Of course, we share a large watershed, the water coming from Germany, coming to a city like Rotterdam. We have outer layers of defense, the levees, the gates, but also room for the river. There are inner city solutions, places where you can store water, like the ponds that you mentioned. So it's really an integrated package. It's a system that you need, and that's what we've seen also in Houston. You need to peel off that system and bring it back, build it up, and assess the various pieces. And don't forget to talk with all the stakeholders. So it's not just integrated planning, I would say it's collaborative planning.
Right. So I want to go back to something Joe said earlier, which is that more communities now are getting hit by floods than ever before. And these are areas sometimes that have never been flooded before. So how do those communities determine how they should invest and what they should invest in? Where do they start?
Well, initially, I think you have to start by determining whether the episode that you've just experienced is really a one-off thing or not. It's possible that it truly is an exceptional situation. But again, the fact that we have rising sea levels and other changes, and again, the changes appear to be happening. We can debate why they're happening. But they're happening, okay? And they have consequences for mitigation efforts. And so one thing these cities need to do, or counties or communities, is to really get a better sense of whether what previously would have been a 100-year event is now more likely to be a 50-year event. Well, if you think that's the case, that has all kinds of consequences for how, for example, you do the economic analysis of mitigation. You know, certain mitigation measures that don't make sense if this is a 100-year event may well make sense if it's a 50-year event, and then you can plan accordingly. So part of this is not just experiencing the event and for a while being concerned. I mean, this is a phenomenon too that people that have studied, you know, natural hazards have observed, is that right after the natural hazard, there's of course quite a lot of awareness of the hazard and discussions of what we might do about it, and people are sort of more aware of the likelihood of the hazard happening, but then that sort of declines over time, and probably 5 years later it's as if the event never happened, and maybe you're not doing the kind of planning, and that kind of awareness I think needs to be sustained over longer periods of time.
And I would say in our community that it hasn't impacted our ability to become unique in a place where people want to come and visit. I mean, we've got a single A affiliate of the Texas Rangers. We've got a hit TV show featuring one of our own chefs. I mean, there are a lot of really neat reasons why people want to come. This isn't blanketing the entire town with floodwaters. But to go to the politics of it, certainly we need the stakeholders, as Edgar mentioned a while ago, and we're working with our state and federal government. The challenge is we think we should be doing X, Y, Z, whether it's building dams or dredging the river or cleaning out the ditches or whatever it is. The challenge for us at local is we don't have the authority to do it. It takes both an act of Congress just to study the issue, and then it takes a second act of Congress to fund the study of the issue. And that's before the 3 to 6 years it ever takes to study the issue, and another 10 to 15 years for they implement the study findings. And I'm going to be a grandfather by the time this is all done.
It should be part of a positive transition, I would say. You know, it pays off to invest in flood protection and flood mitigation. You know, there are many good examples. Looking at places, cities like Rotterdam, where we are integrating solutions, combining challenges, or closer to home, we have the Big U in Manhattan. The first phase of the Big U is actually happening right now. It's a 2.5-mile stretch to protect the Lower East Side community, but we also bring in amenities. So it's not just, you know, a big wall, you know, the walls we've seen in New Orleans, which is all fine, it's functioning, it's working. But you know, in this era of collaborative planning, people also want benefits, and we can bring those benefits into flood protection solutions. And that's more like the longer term play. And that's a strong message, I think, because at the end of the day, money talks.
Yeah, and I think Joe's point about the memory of risk. Risk is, especially when we're talking about low probabilities of seriously big damage.
Yes.
This is a very hard thing for us humans to conceptualize.
Correct.
And then make appropriate behavioral change around it. I'm talking at the individual level, where you prepare and get a first aid kit, and at the city planning level, and at the government funding level. Just a quick, interesting story, just thinking about Boulder, where we have a great research partner, the Dartmouth Flood Observatory, based in Boulder. They do flood mapping all over the world. And as you remember, there was a major flood there in a couple years ago. 2 years after that major flood, there was a proposed public housing right in the floodplain in an area that had flooded during that. And our research partner there, who knew, because he maps floods and lives there, said this is crazy, and so mapped the flood, clearly demonstrated where it had gone, and then brought it to the public hearing and sent to his neighbors, and then people showed up, and there's now not going to be a public housing in that place. But how quickly people forget the hazards and, you know, what exactly was going on there and why they wanted to build. It could be more than just public awareness, or it could just be more than just having the information. But it's a critical piece in how we think about what motivates action to prepare for not just floods in these new communities that are going to have flooding, but even places where we're starting to see it more intensely in new places.
The data is always a baseline. You know, you need to understand how your system works. New York did that really well following Sandy with the Plan YC, the special initiative, Rebuild and Resilience, a big assessment to understand how New York works, also to understand risk, climate risk. At the same time, we should not be blindfolded, I think, by data, because you know, there's always uncertainty, and a model is nothing more than an assumption of the truth. So we should not forget that these plans need to become reality. instead of plans on the shelf, we need work on the ground, and that's an important thing as well.
But I think Betsy's point about the small probability of large losses is quite important in terms of the public perception of all of this, because analysts like me or Betsy or Edgar, we know how to take that into account, okay? And it's actually fairly basic statistics. It's nothing very fancy, but we sort of understand that. But the typical citizen views this and they say, okay, well, we're spending this money on building a big flood wall. And then nothing happens for 20 years. Well, that flood wall, in an expected sense, may have been a very good investment. It's just that they're looking at this and saying, we didn't need it. Why did we spend all this money? And I think that calls for sort of continued efforts to try to educate the public about how to think about these things, because people have difficulty making those kinds of calculations in their own lives, and then we're sort of asking them to accept them when you're making them for sort of public expenditures, for example.
Yeah. I think when it comes to critical assets, that work is happening. You know, it's happening in Miami, it's happening in Boston, in New York City, I mean, in the Bay Area. And critical assets are important. They, as I said, they drive cities. So sewage treatment plants, hospitals, making sure that those are protected and safe. That is happening. But now it comes to the translation to the longer term planning. What are we going to do? How are we going to connect all these dots? That's the next phase, the next level.
So that leads nicely into our first audience question. So as a reminder for those of you watching this live, you can submit questions to our panelists throughout the event. And again, we encourage you to do that. So our first question is, what role does regulation play in mitigating risks now? And what role should it play moving forward? Should regulations be expanded and broadened?
I think it's more about the implementation of the mitigation regulations. I mean, Edgar mentioned, we can study, we can have a really nice, beautiful study and put it on the shelf and it just collects dust, but it's the actual implementation. It's very easy to come in after the fact and sign a $15 billion relief package, which actually, a lot of people don't know, actually froze assets for our own recovery in Matthew in North Carolina from last year. But it's easy to do that. It's harder to take money and put it into the mitigation, to building the walls. Is there return on the investment? I don't know. We're kind of used to it. I would say that our planning efforts across the state, our mapping is really unique, and they've done a great job with it. I don't think it has accounted for the urbanization of our state enough, but that question is being asked, so I know they're working on that. But it's one thing to talk about it, it's one thing to study it, but it's a whole nother ballgame to actually do the real work.
I really, in that regard, admire your responsibility, because the challenges are huge, especially for coastal places, and we tend to look at the past when it comes to addressing risk and trying to mitigate risk and come with solutions. But we know that looking at the past is not going to bring us the solutions of the future. So we really need to bridge that to what is actually needed and be more visionary, translating that to where are we in 25 years, 50 years from now? How do we make sure that we are not stepping into the regret solutions that we have seen so much in Houston or in Miami? Let's not make the mistakes to start with, and then really try to step into the future, because again, the challenges will be huge.
From the economist's perspective, I mean, the question of regulation has everything to do with incentives. So in principle, it would be great if the private sector, perhaps through insurance companies or banks or other entities, provided incentives for private parties, for example, to make investments that promoted resilience, for example. Suffice it to say, there are lots of reasons why markets are not going to work as well as we would like in that particular case. And again, let me come back to this example of the need to take into account that ocean levels have risen, and the fact that increases the likelihood of more severe types of flooding, for example, from storms. You'd like the private market to sort of take that into account, then people would just do it. But to the extent that it doesn't, then you do have a role for the government to come in and basically say, as they do with building codes generally, we need to have a new set of building codes. right? And in that sense, if I can just make a small political comment, you know, the Trump administration's decision to pull back the Obama regulations, which were essentially trying to recognize this fact, I think was a little unfortunate, although there are mixed signals. I gather now they may be rethinking this after they've seen what's happened in Harvey and others. It's because, again, this doesn't have as much to do with what you think is causing the rise in sea levels, but has everything to do with the fact that there's lots of evidence that sea levels are rising and that this is raising the level of risk in many cases. And if markets won't recognize that, then sort of regulation is one traditional mechanism whereby the government can help the market. I mean, it's not replacing it, but it's trying to nudge it in a particular direction where it might not otherwise want to go.
Well, I would say to argue that the market is recognizing the risk and is
That's
stepping
good.
up. You know, we've seen that, and we continue to see that after every disaster. That, you know, the private firms are stepping up. You know, from large telecommunication
Right.
companies, they understand their risk and they know how to mitigate and what needs to get done. But just to your point, I mean, their challenges, the private market challenges, look at commercial real estate, is the same as the public play. You know, but let's bring them together in a more collaborative way
Right.
and see how we are part of the same side of the coin. Because, you know, also in terms of funding, in terms of stakeholders, we need to bring all people together and come with a plan that satisfies everyone.
Yeah, if I can just jump in very quickly. So I, again, mostly work in developing countries with watershed managers, emergency managers, state planning, governments. And they would love the kind of funding, the kind of regulation, the kind of decision-making power that we have in the US in many places in order to implement just the types of data and recommendations that we're giving them to help them manage their watersheds and for the next disaster. But I've started talking, you know, with just even folks who work in the States to ask them about like how much of there is a similarity in the situations there. And there have been many emergency managers at local levels and in federal government have told me that they actually are stymied in many ways in similar situations as what I see in some of the other contexts that I work in. And it's very, you know, it's uneven across the United States, and I don't want to draw a stark line between developing countries and the US. There's incredible innovations and uses in many of the developing countries I work in. But the regulations, I mean, some that Joe have alluded to, people have said are incredibly helpful, from the federal government providing resources to actually take the kind of action that BJ wants to take, and then creating the kind of incentive that folks in these agencies know they want to take to prepare. And now, in many ways, they'll have their hands tied behind their back as we see more and more threats coming and as we see these massive changes happening.
I think that's where the US probably can also learn from other cities in the world. If you look at Jakarta, Indonesia, that's where sea level rise is not even the biggest challenge. It's land subsidence, and you know, making sure that your governance structure is ready to address these accelerated challenges. You know, we are in a way still, you can say, in New York City in a luxurious position, because you know, if there's a surge, you know, the water comes, but the water also recedes. That's very different when you are in New Orleans or when you're in a bathtub like the Netherlands. You know, when the water comes, you better be protected, otherwise, you know, it closes down your city or your country even. So back to your responsibility as a city leader, that's a big effort.
Yeah, and that is the challenge where we are. I mean, the urbanization of the Raleigh-Durham area is a great place to live and work, and I visit often, but it really has become more urban. And the way our Neuse River Basin comes down and the river kind of snakes where we are, over the last 2 decades, we've become a very natural dam because the water just doesn't have anywhere to go. And thinking about, you know, where government is and where the private markets are, I know we haven't talked about it yet, we kind of alluded to it, was the NFIP program, and I'm not an expert on it, but I did speak to a business owner this morning who's used it, and he told me he's been flooded a couple of times, and I've been right there with him cleaning what he called the Neuse juice, which is the Neuse River out from his business. And I mean, he basically said that, look, you know, there's a cap, it's $500,000 for the content, $500,000 for the structure, but it's not enough. And when he went to the private market, hey, what are y'all doing? They said, well, it's not based on the amount of loss, it's based on the number of days you're out of work. And so he's like, well, as soon as we were allowed, we went as fast as we could to get open. So there's nothing in the private market to help with the flood protection and restoration of the business.
I think we should also be looking at alternatives. You know, the NFIP, of course, it's there. It's a structure that functions the way it does. At the same time,
But
there are alternatives.
it doesn't include business interruption insurance either.
No,
I mean, it needs to
doesn't.
have another leg to it.
Although, see, this is an example where there's a balancing issue, okay? So I understand what he's saying. I mean, anybody would like to be fully indemnified for any loss, right? However, there's a sort of basic principle in insurance that if you have some ability, for example, to control your loss, then there may be a point where too much indemnification creates moral hazard, which means that you are less likely to undertake measures to reduce the loss. What needs to happen in NFIP, I think the program needs to be looked at from the ground up. I mean, it was created in the 60s when we had the big floods, and it was really meant in some ways to be a more orderly replacement for what was then seen as a lot of haphazard charity and goodwill, right? And it's had problems all along. Now they've got an opportunity to look at it. And so the question is, what is the proper balance, if you will, between insuring on the one hand and yet sort of minimizing the incentives of individuals to perhaps take more risk than we'd like them? That's a tricky question. And
I would say in terms of this particular business in
Yeah.
this area that's been flooded, the business district that's been flooded, which is one of our largest retail sales tax
Right.
bases. When it was originally built, it was not in the 100-year floodplain.
Right.
But over the last
Okay.
couple of decades, it's become that way. But I know, because we've become experts on how to help right before a flood comes, I know how much money they spent just taking all their products off the shelves and storing them away. But still, when you've got 3 feet or 4 feet of water in there,
yes.
and what I'm saying is the NFIP, yes, it should be looked at. But I would say in this case, it's not flexible enough to account for somebody who has a higher dollar volume in their business and really wants to get back to work. It does the exact opposite. It wants to help somebody who's not doing well and is going to be really lazy in getting back in,
yeah, well,
or
that's
can't
what
get
I'm
back
saying.
in.
One needs to look at the whole program and really try to ask, given that we want to do this, so that what's the most desirable way, taking into account all of these trade-offs. We have an opportunity to do it now because they have to reauthorize the program.
Right.
I don't know whether they're going to give it the time it deserves, because it's an important part of these mix of strategies to deal with these national hazards. I don't think there are some people who say we just should not have it and leave it to the private market.
I know this is a hot topic. I'm not sure if we're going to come to any conclusions today. I do want to get to some more of our audience questions, though. We have one here on flood mapping. It says flood mapping relies on past events, so new events can change where high-risk zones are found. How do we communicate the real risk exists outside of the existing floodplain zones? And this comes back to the question of communication. So how do you communicate risk and improve the perception of risk amongst both individuals as well as community leaders?
Well, I would say at a local level, we do that through our planning and zoning ordinances allowing a building to operate here. But when FEMA bought out those properties with the city and county, they didn't allow for structures to be be erected there. So we've actually got a challenge of what to do with all this land, for recreational uses and whatnot, because people want to build hotels, and we say, well, we can't do that. At a local level, it's very easy for us to communicate. But when you're talking about a national level or international level, I'm not the expert on that.
Yeah.
Well, I would say there's always uncertainty in whatever data you present to your community, and being honest about that uncertainty is a good starting point, because you just put it on the table, and you have an open, fair discussion on where you are at this point. So I think that's in general a good starting point. But then it's about translating that to what can be done, and with that uncertainty, and I think a good strategy could be like adaptive planning. So rather than aiming at a solution that provides a certain level of risk reduction, because it's always about a level of risk reduction. You can say, well, maybe we should aim for a lower level or even a higher level, but make sure that we can adapt over time, so it's not becoming a regret investment that you are making.
And that requires not just giving a community a new set of flood maps and saying, here, one needs to educate them about how to use those flood maps, and also about the costs that can be avoided by making proper use of those things. Again, the problem is that these costs avoided are out there somewhere in the future, but their size, at least if nothing else, should at least give some pause and say, well, maybe we ought to take a look at this and consider what are we going to put in these areas. Is it big hotels? Maybe not. Is it something else, right?
Yeah, listen, I love data too. I love flood mapping, and I'm all for sort of data transparency. But the fact of the matter is that people are experiential learners. We learn by basically, you learn to not put your hand on a fire because you touched hot things in the past. And our ability to understand long-term risks like flooding, especially that are hard to conceptualize, big impact, low probability, really comes down to our ability to feel it emotionally. This is both for individuals and then our decision makers at fairly high levels. So I think we also need to get a lot of expertise in the communication sector too, and thinking about how to communicate to different audiences. And all people are not the same, and what resonates, what kind of stories, what kind of facts, what kind of situations resonate with different people in different places. We've just a little bit of work from the Yale program on climate change communication has shown that actually party affiliation can change the way that people even just see are willing to evacuate and see emergency warning. We tend to see that people who are more Republican are more likely to stay, but they're also more likely to be individually prepared as the hurricanes come. So I think a lot more depth of expertise in that side of the equation to get to the audience members' question, I think is really critical as we try to survive this.
And you alluded to it earlier in terms of poor areas tend to be not all the time, but tend to be the ones that flood. And they also tend to be the ones who don't have the resources to do this communication as the question. We've got 1.5 members in our planning department, but then we're a town of 21,000 people, but a town of 10, they may be lucky to have one, or it's outsourced. So the resources, the smaller your town you get, or unincorporated areas, is a challenge.
Yeah, but in the end of the day, you need to make data tangible. You need to make it real, visible. And of course, when you've gone through an experience like Sandy or Harvey or Irma, I mean, you don't really have to explain data or the implications of data. But making that translation again, to what you can do. We've seen the rebuild by design process in the New York area. So everyone experienced the risk. We've all seen the water in the streets. But bridging that through design to what can be done, that's making it tangible, and it allows to open up a process to, okay, this is what we experienced, this is where we are right now, and where ideally do we want to be with all the uncertainty that we have, and how do we do that in such a way that we don't regret the investments we need to make.
Yeah.
So speaking of investments, we have another audience question on this. What are some innovative ways communities can fund or achieve their flood mitigation goals, assuming they don't have big budgets locally or federal funds to do it? Any innovative ways that they can get things done?
My response would be, and this perhaps it depends on the scale of this question, there are a couple of excellent examples in the world. If you look at the Netherlands, cities like Scheveningen or Katwijk, where they had massive parking problems. During beautiful sunny days, a lot of visitors, tourists coming to the coast. At the same time, we had to upgrade our flood defense systems. So we combined these two challenges. We integrated parking space within levees at the coast. And of course there's a developer that's responsible for the parking space, but it's also contributing to flood safety. There are urban levees in a city like Rotterdam where you can bring amenities in your levee. So small stores little shops that were never there before. And it completely changes the economics, the community perspective on space and how flood risk solutions are actually being experienced. And it brings communities together. They start to debate what is going on, and they start to feel ownership, and it's basically changing the entire area in a very positive way. So it's combining challenges and trying to find a mechanism to bring other funding streams into what you need to do.
Well, in another way, which is not entirely costless from a budgetary perspective, is to try to provide some incentives for private parties to make these investments. There will be probably a cost in the form of tax credits, foregone tax revenue, but that's not the same thing as actually going out necessarily and raising the money to complete the project entirely from public funding. So I think that's definitely an alternative in a number of these ways where you can, well, for example, in the general example you've given, you might provide an additional incentive for a private developer to do certain things as they develop a hotel, for example, to perhaps provide runoff or some reservoirs as part of that or whatever. And you have kind of the standard instruments that local communities have for that, which maybe sometimes use more than they should, but I think this would be a worthy use, which is the use of property tax abatements, credits, and the like.
I was going to say, Bessie, you often work in developing countries and in areas that probably don't have federal funding or big budgets. What are some of the ways you've seen communities fund these projects?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that there is no way to get around that the size of some of the infrastructure builds and the programs that we need, and government needs to play a role that corporations can, but there are low-cost things that we can do. One thing is that oftentimes your first responder, your best first responder, is your neighbor. We see time and time again people who just go check on the elderly person next door to make sure they're okay in a disaster, or they can evacuate, or they're not stuck in a room that's now molding with toxins. So do you know your neighbor? Do you know if they have a car and they can evacuate with you? It can really save lives. So there's things like that we can do, and I completely agree. And I've been just so inspired by some of the things I've seen in developing countries where communities are empowered, and I think there's critical elements of that. One just interesting example from new technology is during the Chennai floods in 2015 in India, devastating to the economy there. A local tech company just threw up a map and said, map if it's flooding on your street. Just click here, very, very simple, and it seems like actually a pretty sophisticated flood extent map of urban flooding in this area. And they just found anecdotally that people were actually using that to see if their loved ones were in danger, or using that to figure out which roads to get around to in order to try to get to work so they could have some income. We're testing this right now to see how similar it was to the actual footprint that we've detected from satellite imagery. But there are real examples like that when communities are empowered to take action into their own hands.
And we lived through that ourselves. The state of North Carolina put together their map. They got a great mapping team, put together an inundation map at 23 feet for Kinston. This is what it would do, 25 feet, 26, 30 feet. This is what it would do. And we were able to take that data on a local level, and our city and county applied our tax parcel data on top of it to say, okay, this parcel was going to get flooded at 23 feet or not at 26. So we were able, in the emergency itself, to go door to door and say, get out of the way, get out of the way. When we literally held like a prayer vigil where everybody kind of gathered, the town gathered, and then we left there going, okay, prayer's great, but you need to do the work, and everybody went and knocked on doors. But that still didn't, if that same energy could be put into what do we need to do to stop the next major disaster from, the river's going to flood, the rain is going to come, but we kind of are living in this Chicken Little world where the sky's fallen because it's happened 4 times in my 37 years, the 4 of the 6 highest crests we've ever seen, and that's only going to get worse, not better.
So speaking of getting worse, not better, one of our audience questions is on climate change, and they'd like your views on climate change. Particularly, what role do you think global warming has played in increasing the frequency and severity of hurricanes and major storms?
Well, I would say so far this year, we are in the midst of the peak of hurricane season, and what has come our way and is right now happening in the Caribbean as we speak. There's Harvey, there's Irma, there's Jose, there's Maria. That's pretty amazing. So we will see more frequent storms. Intensity of storms will be more significant. The impact, we talked about that through urbanization. The impact will be much more significant. So in terms of risk, we are at risk. There's no question about that.
Well, it's been interesting in light of Harvey and Irma, because there have been a number of discussions in the popular press, obviously, about is this caused by climate change or not. I found the response of a lot of the weather people, the meteorologists, and some of the people that work on climate change interesting, and that is they were pretty careful about this. They said, well, we really can't be certain that climate change is necessarily causing these events. We need much more information about that. What our models seem to have told us is that if these events happen, they're likely to be more severe. And now we're getting a picture of what more severe looks like, okay? So you could actually be agnostic about climate change and nonetheless accept the proposition that maybe things are changing for whatever reason, and that has clear consequences for what you do with mitigation, okay? Because mitigation is a separate activity from, for example, what they want to do in the Paris Accords, which is they want to stop a process. But let's say you don't agree with the process, but nonetheless you see certain things happening. I think that does have some direct implications for where we go. I mean, basically I read this as saying the likelihood of having severe storms appears now to be increasing, and there are ways that we can prepare for that, allowing for the uncertainty, okay?
I would say, at the end of the day, communities on, say, St. Martin or, impacted so dramatically, or during Sandy in Breezy Point, those communities don't care all that much. They had to rebuild, and St. Martin, they have to rebuild. But it's not about rebuilding this whole question. It's about rethinking. We need to step up. We know that. So let's try to articulate the data we have, or the data we need to develop. Combine data sources, which is also where we can have, a lot of impact. Let's see what's happening in Miami, but also bring in the Everglades and make it regional, and not just, look at our own backyard, because that's where it goes wrong. We need to make it bigger, bring the data sources together, plan in a more integrated, holistic way, and really rethink the landscape we want to have, say, in 50 years from now.
Yeah, I've seen numbers, just globally speaking, and large trends here, that exposure to just riverine flooding is going to be doubling between the year 2015 and 2030. This is some data that's coming out from WRI. And it's partly climate change, but it's also partly other types of global transformation. Right. It's both urbanization, so it's the kind of thing we've been talking about here, more impervious surfaces, more development, more people.
Wetlands.
Exactly, but then it's also population migration, people moving into floodplains because they're cheaper in certain places, or because that's where economic centers are. We see this in the US. I just saw 7,000 people apparently moved into a known 100-year flood zone in Houston in the last couple of years. And we see people migrating into megacities in major floodplains, expanding floodplains in Asia. So we have to address the problems that we see here, and at pretty massive scales.
I think in South Florida they call it climate gentrification, where there's already a movement to higher ground. But it's really, how with the time we have and the exposure, the vulnerability, how do we protect our critical assets? Because Miami Beach is there, and it won't go away for the upcoming decade. So how do we protect the infrastructure we have? And that for Miami Beach requires study. We need to step up and bring data together and map our vulnerability.
But I mean, how much do we, there's both, we need to address climate change, I feel strongly, and mitigation is critical. Like, we need to stop creating the problem. We also have to address and adapt to the issue that we have now and make communities more resilient, because they're going to see tremendous amounts of loss of life and livelihood. And then at what point does relocation make sense? I mean, I think we need to seriously put that on the table. And the U.S., it's no, it costs a pretty penny, but and the U.S. has started to think about this through programs in HUD. And to what extent is this true for, I mean, we even like very low-income or informal settlements in the floodplains in places like India or Bangladesh. We need to look at all these major solutions.
Well, and I would say that my trouble with the discussion, not here, but on a national level, is we're literally, the governor has flood, one of our busiest intersections is flooded behind him. One of our most popular hotels has got 4 foot of water in it, and he's getting asked by the media in front of him, national media, what about climate change? And he's going, who cares about that right now? We need to save people from harm's way. We'll get to that discussion later. And the challenge with this topic is that it's just as much logical as it is emotional. And the truth is, my opinion, is that this is going to be one of those topics where you just got to get a bunch of people in the same room. You shut the door. You feed them pizza. You slide under the door, and you figure it out, because we can't even agree on the facts, much less the policy.
The solution is pizza.
That's right.
All right, another audience question, and Edgar, you alluded to this earlier with some of your examples. What can the U.S. and our communities learn from other countries, such as the Netherlands, when it comes to preparing for future storms? So Netherlands, world leader in flood mitigation. Tell us about it.
Well, let me explain the Dutch system in 1 minute. But no, it's, I mean, for the Dutch, there's no way back. I mean, we have to, we call it live with water, and of course that comes with an extensive defense system. So let's not, fool around that. We have dunes, we have the Delta Works, we have massive gates. So that allows us to work out inner city solutions and try to develop a system that is safe for the next, well, say 75 years, maybe a little bit longer. It requires funding. It requires upfront funding. So operation and maintenance is always a challenge for communities. So you need to assess, or I would almost say like touch all the colors of the rainbow, and that's what we try to do in the Netherlands. You need to think and plan holistically. You need to allow yourself to plan 25, 50 years ahead with all the uncertainty, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. So best practices. I mean, I'm talking about flood risk and resilience a lot, and showing these great examples from cities like Rotterdam or Scheveningen. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. The U.S. needs to develop its own best practices, and it's happening. I mean, I'm pretty hopeful. Looking at cities like Norfolk or New York, it's happening, and that will give I would say pride in a different way. So it's not just emergency response, but it's also proactive planning and showing, well, we are prepared and we are ready to address the next event in a better way. And I think that's something the Dutch take a lot of pride in. Literally, when the Maasland barrier in front of Rotterdam closes, it's on the national news, and we all feel like, yes, it's closing, and we feel safe. Well, I think that's a process that the U.S. still needs to adopt and feel more comfortable with.
But you made an interesting comment to BJ and me before the session here that the Dutch, in fact, rely very much on getting this right, and they really don't have a mechanism where, if God forbid one of these things didn't work, to react to it the way the U.S. is able to, or has shown itself to be able to react to it in the case of Harvey Irma.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, this is where we can learn from each other.
Yeah.
So the Dutch can definitely learn from emergency response processes in the U.S. I mean, we don't have flood insurance in the Netherlands because we have our system. We don't need it. At least we think we don't need it. But we need to learn from each other, and that's happening. I mean, we bring Dutch expertise to the U.S. At the same time, more and more Dutch officials travel abroad, and they learn how cities like Rotterdam respond, and that's something that's very important. And organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation, 100 Resilient Cities, or C40 is actively trying to make these connections and be a knowledge bridge all over the globe, because we have to learn from each other. also bring it to third world countries who don't have the opportunity often, and resources to study all this. So let's help them and bring it to those places.
And I would say, tying that into an earlier piece about communication, is that I did, as well as you'll see our governors, they do a lot with the media and with social media. Because especially during hurricanes, the power might be out, but you still have your battery on your phone. And I have learned through 2 major storms that people pay attention to their Twitter feed and their Facebook feed. And so literally the night of Matthew, we're going through flash flooding. I'm on Facebook Live saying this is what's happening. We're rescuing 300 people. Get out, make sure you stay indoors, don't venture out. And I think maybe that's one of the tools. When you see our governor day after day, sometimes twice a day, doing updates to the media, and he's got his whole team behind him, and he's got an interpreter there as well. I mean, that small little thing of getting communication to people could absolutely save lives.
Yeah, but this is, I mean, we all use our iPhones, and smart flood control in not too long from now will be part of that. We'll be looking on our iPhones to see what the situation is. And probably in a place like New York, that's not such a bad idea because everyone is staring at their iPhones all the time. But in more rural, coastal communities, yeah, I mean, this is what you do.
And it goes off. We've got the emergency alert system goes off if flood warnings are coming.
Yeah, but it requires, again, it requires smart flood control, to allow that kind of data to be really valuable. Smart flood control needs to be brought to a higher level, and again it comes down to data and accessible data.
Absolutely, and I think there can be a clear interplay between these types of data and bringing people in to participate, not just as sort of observers or recipients, but actually help us analyze what's going on, because in many ways these people just in the community can, they're like, yep, flooding at my ankle right now. And I'm like trying to analyze, like, oh, is it flooding from the satellite imagery? And it's, but this, I think social media is interesting because it is in kind of citizen science, or the empowered citizen, is a way that developing countries might be able to leapfrog us. And as you incorporate that data into a system, I was recently at a development bank, and they were saying, like, sort of like asking about fancy stuff we could do, and then was saying, just like pulling up on Twitter some flooding in Northern Ireland, and say, this is how we know it's flooding there. We're like, actually, that's really useful data that we can incorporate, and it goes together. We can meld that with some of our remote sensing and some of the more traditional hydro models. But yeah, we need to think very out of the box, and some of the innovations are coming from the, I think, lowest resource and lowest funded areas.
That's right.
Well, on that, we're going to conclude today's panel. I'd like to thank you all very much. This has been a brilliant discussion on mitigation, both in the United States as well as elsewhere. And I hope our audience was able to gain some insights from our panelists today as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.